Well, good afternoon. Lovely to have everyone here this afternoon. Thank you very much for taking time out of your very busy days. My name is Jade Cleave, and today I'm representing Intellischool as the Education Specialist. Basically a fancy way of saying I'm the resident teacher here at Intellischool. And this afternoon, I'm really looking forward to walking you through how you can make the most of your NAPLAN data throughout our Intellischool dashboards. So just a very brief background on myself. As I say, I am the resident teacher here, so I have a teaching background, and I only stepped out of the classroom reasonably recently from a large K-12 school here in Melbourne. And my bread and butter was the middle years, so years 5 to 8. And I was also a head of department, homeroom teacher. I wore many hats. So my very favourite thing to do is to support teachers with best practice with our dashboards. I also have the wonderful Dave and Rowan in the background helping us out with the back end of things. So without further ado, we are going to get cracking. Little bit of housekeeping. You will notice that there is a chat window for you to type questions. So please do feel free to type some questions, and it's likely that we will get a little bit of time at the end to come back to those questions, but Dave and Rowan will be keeping an eye on those as well. For those of you who have registered, and we're so thrilled to have had so many registrations today, you will receive a link to this recording and also to the presentation slides after the session. So if you see something in the slides that you think, oh, I should jot that down, don't stress, you will get a copy of that afterwards. If any of you would like to receive a PD certificate for this session, because you are going to be joining us for some good best practice around data and the way we can use NAPLAN in our dashboards, please shoot me an email after the session, which is just jade@intellischool.co. So please get in touch if you would like that. All right, I should go forward, not backwards. Okay, so 3 key areas that I'd like to cover today, and I'm thrilled that we have a lovely mix of both our subscriber schools who are along with us today and also those who don't currently use Intellischool. NAPLAN being the topic of the hour, I want to run you through first what to expect as far as publication of 2023 NAPLAN results is concerned throughout our Intellischool dashboards. Then, to give us a taste of how we can take that data and put it into practice to make real impact on our student outcomes, there's 2 of our dashboard reports that I'd like to focus on, and they're both in our cohort profile. The first one being the Standardised testing tab, and the second one being the relative growth report. So I want to run you through what these reports can tell us about the NAPLAN data. But then the more important step is how we can actually use this information in practice. And I'm quite excited. I have a couple of actual proper like classroom tips and like department tips as well to use with staff. Then to finish off, I want to make sure you know where to access further support and information, and we'll come to some of those questions if we get those in the chat window. So buckle in, I hope you enjoy. First things first, let's have a chat about what to expect with your 2023 NAPLAN results throughout your Intellischool dashboard. So I'm sure it's no secret at this point to any of you that changes have been made to the way that NAPLAN results are reported as of this year. We are still waiting for certain data to be published by ACARA. And of course, as you can imagine, we're keeping an eye on this very closely so that when it is available, we're ready to act as soon as possible. And while we wait for that, we're taking steps right now to plan how to best present that data throughout our dashboards in line with those changes. And as, again, I'm sure you can appreciate, we must be presenting those results in accordance with those new formats. And that will result in a bit of redevelopment of our user interface. And in just a moment, I'm going to give you a sneak peek of that. What's also really important to note, for good reason, is that NAPLAN is advising against backwards comparison of results. That's going to impact, for those of you who already subscribe to Intellischool, you're likely aware that we have some growth visualizations in different parts of our dashboards. Those will be impacted. And again, we're working on that right now. On the right-hand side of the screen is a QR code that you can come back to. It is an FAQ blog post. So we tried to anticipate as many of the questions as possible that we know you'll have about your results. So please do take the time to have a read of that if you haven't already. And as I mentioned, I wanted to give you a brief sneak peek of what to expect with some of those adaptations to visualizations. Thankfully, the changes are reasonably minimal. So you'll see over here on the right-hand side that those new proficiency levels will be reflected, of course, in our standardized testing tab. You'll see even in our demo today, which is using the current set of standards, normally this stacked bar chart would be 3, whereas it'll be separated into 4 going forward. And then there will be a few different areas of the dashboard reports where a letter representing that proficiency level is used rather than a number where previously we would have had a band. So that's just a quick snapshot of what to expect. Of course, again, those who are current subscribers, you have a dedicated engagement manager. You've got myself. Please always reach out. If you've got questions about that, we're here and ready to support you. Okay, let's get into the good stuff. So cohort standardized testing. So firstly, I want to give you the high-level overview of what this report can tell us. Then I'm going to jump straight into a demo environment so you can see it in the flesh. Number one, what we can do with this report is we can identify a spread of cohort results across those different NAPLAN proficiency levels. So again, you'll get to see these stacked bar charts in action in a moment. We can also identify individual student scores for previous results bands and also ranking within the cohort. We've got some separate tabs here that do that. Probably my favorite part, which is where we'll get into some of the practical strategies, is the ability to drill into question level data. So what we'll actually do is show you how you can identify top areas for improvement, which is effectively identifying the ZPD for students, which is awesome. What you can also do using what's called a Sankey chart is you can visualize student progression through adaptive testing banks. So I'm aware, of course, as of the last year or two, I think everyone is now doing the adaptive NAPLAN tests. So it's quite interesting to drill into that as well. So I'm going to very briefly stop sharing and I'm going to switch to a different tab because it's now time for me to show you the demo environment. Okay, so what you see here is our cohort profile, and you'll see there's a number of different tabs, but for today, we're focusing on standardized testing, and then in a little bit, we will get to relative growth. So as I mentioned at the very start, you will see stacked bar charts that represent the spread of cohort achievement across the different sub-test areas, in this case for NAPLAN. Also important to note that you can isolate different time periods. You can look at a specific instance of NAPLAN testing. In this dummy environment, I've just got the one, but for many of the schools that I know are here today, you'll see a reasonable list of those different options. Underneath our stacked bar charts, we have a couple of additional tabs. Let's start with this Insights tab here. So underneath the Insights, we've got listed top areas for improvement. So broken down into each of these different sub areas, we've identified 6 top skills for whom the largest number of students have this skill in their zone of proximal development. So in the case of identifying correct use of commas, I can click on the number 27 here, and it's going to show me that list of students. So hopefully the wheels are starting to turn with just how powerful that could actually be to have those groupings of students automatically identified for you. Because we're going to go into practical strategy shortly, I will move now to the results by student tab. Reasonably straightforward tabular view here, but the nice thing is the ability to click onto the headers of each of these columns, that means you can actually very easily identify those who might be sitting at the top and the bottom of the performance scale. Each of our different subtest types has its own tab. So we're going to jump into grammar and punctuation. And what we see here is what's called a Sankey chart. Now, often when I go into schools, I'll ask, have we ever heard of a Sankey chart before? And most of the time it's a no, and that's totally fine. It often looks like a big pile of spaghetti, and it's perhaps comes across as more complex than it actually is. So what a Sankey chart is representing here is flow between different banks within this adaptive test. So what I can actually do is click on these colored rectangles here, and it's going to reveal these are the students who started in this particular bank of questions. And as they progress through the test, depending on their responses, of course, students are then directed towards different banks of questions. What I can also do is I can click on an individual student's name, and that's going to reveal their path through that adaptive testing, which again, when we're at that individual student level, really, really excellent to be able to see, and even to then isolate, okay, who were the students who ended up in this top bank over here versus who were those who ended up further towards the bottom. Now, underneath our Sankey chart, probably something that you're much more familiar with is a Gutman analysis. So we've got a Gutman chart underneath this here. So again, just very briefly for those who might need a refresher, the number next to the student's name is the number of questions in that bank that they answered correctly, with correct answers being denoted with a green cell. Grey cells that we see here, those are actually skipped questions, and then we can see incorrect answers in red. The number at the top of each of these columns is the number of students who answered that question correctly. And I can click on that to actually reveal what was the skill being assessed. You'll notice that there's a few stars throughout this chart. So what we can actually see here is identification of the zone of proximal development for that individual student. So again, I understand that Gutman's can be sometimes a bit of a subjective sort of thing. But what we've done here is analyze the breakdown pattern to see where students start to either skip or answer questions incorrectly, to identify where are they ready to learn next. You'll also notice that these different colors along the top either are lighter or darker. Now, where they're darker, that means that this particular skill, more students had this skill in their zone of proximal development. So I would say as a class or as a group of students, that would be a really excellent place to focus on. Lastly, before I stop this and go back into my slides, and we're going to talk some practical strategies, I just want to point out at the top, in the top right-hand corner over here, at the moment, I've chosen a year 10 cohort, but when it comes to analysing a cohort, it doesn't just have to be a year level. You could do it by subject, and you could do it by individual class as well. So depending on the size of your school, depending on the year levels that we're talking about, I'm sure you can imagine that there are different use cases where one would be more beneficial versus the other. All right, so I'm going to briefly stop sharing again. Switch over one more time back to my slides. Okay, so using this information in practice, this is what I love talking about. So an in-class activity that I wanted to teach you all about today, I could speak about this for ages, but we only have so much time. So I'm going to give you one example of something I would do with that question level data. Firstly, I would make sure that I isolate the analysis to my specific class. So I'm thinking with my classroom teacher hat on here, I'd be using that section underneath the stacked bar charts, top areas for improvement, where it's identified what are some of those top 6 skills in each of those different subtests where the kids need the most work. With a little bit of help, they will be ready to master that skill next. You know your students best. So it could be that what I've listed here as number 1, I would like to spend some time to actually explicitly go back over that particular skill. But it could be that that strategy works really well for your class, or perhaps something else. So take all of this with a grain of salt. I know that you will adapt it to suit what's going to work for you best. But what I want to teach you about today is what I call my noughts and crosses revision activity. And it's quite likely that you've used a variant of this before. I think it's a fabulous opportunity for student agency. So the kids get to pick what they want to focus on. It's flexible, and realistically, it's really easy to build in differentiation to an activity like this. So what I would do with my noughts and crosses activity, again, I would have that Intellischool dashboard open where I know what are those skills that I want the kids to focus on so that we can master them. We can go from having them in the ZPD to knowing them really well. Nine grid squares, just like a game of noughts and crosses. And each square is either an individual question, or it could be an activity, but they're all related to those top skills for improvement. What I really like about this activity is it can be toned all the way up to make it reasonably challenging, and in fact a bit more of it could last a whole week, an activity like this, or it could be scaled all the way back just to really simple questions in each box. And for that reason, I think it adapts really well to different year levels as well. So all the way down from junior through to senior secondary, there are ways that you could adapt an activity like this. Occasionally, what I would do is also color code the boxes just in like a light shade to give the kids an idea of, okay, if you want to challenge yourself today, I want you to pick this purple box. But if you want to start a little bit easier, pick the orange box. And I would always say to the kids as well, you might start with like a mid-level question and you might end up finding that quite easy. So that's fine. You can change the level of difficulty as you go along. The ultimate goal in any case is to complete 3 in a row. So again, the kids could end up doing it in any order they like. But I think what I have experienced in my own classes is that by having the option to choose, that opportunity to do what they want to do, it can end up being really great for small group work, or it could be great for quiet individual work. Hopefully this has just given you a bit of food for thought about how having those top areas for improvement automatically identified for you feeds really nicely into an activity like this. So other than in the classroom, I was also a head of department for a number of years. So I have some really good ideas for how you could take that information and have the team work together to actually reflect on your skills. What I would do first of all is, depending on the size of your working team or department, you could break into small groups, you could break into pairs. Again, you will know what works best for your department. Let's just say if we were talking literacy, in this case, we're taking our NAPLAN literacy results where we've got reading, writing, and then grammar and punctuation. I would allocate each group or pair a different test type. And let's just say if it were numeracy instead, you've still got the top 6 there. So you could allocate a different skill to each of your different groups or pairs. I think particularly while these NAPLAN results are hot off the press, even though the kids did them, a few months ago earlier in the year, they're still really fresh results. Let's complete an audit of how well we actually cover these skills in our current assessment, curriculum, and resources. So you could easily set aside an hour or more to do an audit like this. We want staff to discuss, okay, so what has worked well when teaching that topic, and getting them to share ideas that they've used in their own classes. But it's also really important to share what hasn't worked well, because clearly this is a skill that kids are nearly there. They're nearly able to master it, but not quite. We've got quite a number of kids who need support with that. And then, of course, getting them to buy into the process. How can we improve? What would they suggest? What would they like to see change in terms of practice, resources, approach to teaching, to make sure that kids can master those skills going forward? So again, very adaptable depending on the size of your cohort, the size of your working teams. But the idea would be to sit down as a team and actually pick apart the skills that have been identified as those top areas for improvement. Okay, now we are going to move on to cohort relative growth at this point. So this chart, again, lots of opportunities for discussion. I think the data is there to tell a story, but what's really important is for us to then, together as a teaching team, take it and unpack it. So what it will allow us to do is to identify student groupings based on both achievement and growth. And the great thing is too, which you'll see when we jump into the demo in just a moment, is it's not isolated to just the likes of NAPLAN. What you can do in this chart is you can also compare external results, so things like NAPLAN, things like PAT testing, things like essential assessment, with your internal teacher judgments as well. What we can do as well is we can isolate the growth and achievement for specific time periods. That's really important too, and also for specific learning domains. So depending on your role in the school, there's certainly use cases and justification for looking at the whole picture, so looking at all subjects and perhaps a broader time period, I would be thinking someone like a head of teaching and learning, potentially a head of year level as well, versus being able to isolate to just English or just science or just maths and have the head of department and the English teaching team drill into that specific information. So clearly I jumped the gun. My third point was that you can compare specific testing types. So being able to get a picture of what's being reported through external testing versus what's being reported through internal school assessments as well. So it's really quite interesting to break that down. And then we also have built into this dashboard here what we call insight cards. And they're intended to very quickly and easily identify key information. So what we'll do is I once again stop sharing and let's jump into our demo once more. So instead of standardized testing, this time I'm coming over here to relative growth. Okay, so taking a look at our relative growth chart. So let's point out a few important places to pay attention to here. Along the top, I can see the different testing sources I have available to me in this dummy environment. Those of you who are watching today who are already subscribers, you might think that looks familiar, or perhaps you might be seeing some slightly different testing sources, and that's okay. There is obviously flexibility there in terms of what can be visualized in this tab. Up the very top, I always point out when I run training with teachers to carefully choose your time frame, because that can have a big impact on what you see in this scatter plot here. So be sure to choose that. And then, as I mentioned, over here in the right, what I can do is isolate just a particular learning area, and you'll see the little dots scurry around as soon as I do that as well. But for now, let's just take a look at the broader picture. Now, over on the left-hand side here are these insight cards that I mentioned as well. So what we are highlighting here is growth average across the cohort, across a given time frame, and across all subject areas. Same for performance average, who our highest grower is in this given cohort, and then who the lowest grower is. Let's take a look at the actual quadrant chart itself. So as you've probably guessed by now, each of these different plot points represents an individual student. So what we have plotted on the x-axis, so from left to right, is achievement. So how well they've actually performed in the given subject areas. And then on the y-axis, so from top to bottom, we have growth. So effectively what's important here, especially in the context of analysing NAPLAN results, we're really paying attention to anyone who's below that line, because effectively what that means is we're seeing regression, which is something we want to address. But in terms of breaking down the 4 quadrants, so in the top left quadrant, we've labelled this as most improved, because what we see with these students who sit up here, they are not necessarily the strongest performers, but given that they are north on that growth axis, they are showing improvement. So that's really promising. Over in the top right is probably what you'd consider to be your high flyers, where not only are they showing really strong growth, but they're also really strong performers. So clearly we want to see what those students are doing and see what we can do to replicate that. Bottom right quadrant, high achievement, but low growth. Or in this case, we've got quite a few who are high achievers, but they've actually regressed. I would consider these kids potential coasters. So students who are clearly very capable, but perhaps are not being extended enough or given opportunities to grow enough in the current circumstances. And I would say perhaps cause for most concern would be over here in the bottom left, we have the students who are both either not growing or regressing, and their achievement is not so great. So really we want to be isolating these kids to see what is going on. And I've got a few different questions for you to consider. A lot of the practical strategies I'll walk you through in a moment do focus on these kids that are in those 2 lower quadrants, because clearly regression is something that needs to be addressed as quickly as we can. Now, if I click on an individual student, This is where the fun begins. It gets a bit colourful. You'll notice that there are different coloured dots representing those different testing types. So it's going to explode and show us each of the instances of testing that contributed to their position in the quadrant at that stage. Now, you'll notice as well that some of the circles are a bit more hollow and others are solid colours. So if I click on a solid colour here, it's going to give me a breakdown of the type of testing, the specific domain, and then other information, including when that result happened, what their growth score was, and then also performance rank. Anything that sits here on that x-axis, so we've got a NAPLAN reading result here, because in this instance for NAPLAN reading, so this is for Darcy, we've only got one data set worth of NAPLAN results for Darcy. What that means is it's not possible for us to calculate a growth score. So this is probably really good information for those who are already using us. If you ever see those dots that are just sitting there on the x-axis, it's because we don't have a secondary data point with which to compare. Therefore, we can't calculate that growth. What you can also do as well is when you're in this view, you can come back up here to the learning domains, and maybe I just want to isolate English for Darcy, or maybe I just want to isolate mathematics. So you can absolutely play around with what's being visualized as you're looking at an individual student. I will note too, because there's quite a few dots here, and again, if we're looking at a large cohort, you might have a particular student in mind that you want to see. You can search for them, thankfully. So you can click in the bar up the top here, and you can either scroll, or I could type in a name, and then that will show me that student straight away. I will note too that now that I've clicked on an individual student, so Wendy here in this case, the table underneath is now isolated just to her information, as well as the insight cards on the left. So growth average for Wendy, as well as her performance average. And previously what we were seeing with the highest and lowest growth from students, like we would see their individual names, but what we see now are the individual subject areas where they've had their highest and lowest growth. So those insight cards do adapt based on what you're looking at the time. And the last thing I'll point out before we go into some practical strategies is that the tabular view underneath the scatter plot is pretty simple, but what I do like is the ability, again, to sort them from highest to lowest, so I can get a visual on the names, and then also I can see, okay, so great, I can see that Billy's growing really well, as is Xavier, Jacinta, and Darcy. But if I were to reverse that, I know who are some of the students who need attention to ensure that we can reverse that regression. So what we'll do, stop sharing once again, I'm getting better at this, and let's go back into my slides. Let's talk some practical strategies. So let's just say this one, my strategies focus more on what you could do as a team. So what you can do as a teaching team as opposed to what you can do in the classroom. And as I mentioned before, this time around, I want to focus on students that are south of that x-axis, so those who are showing either no growth or regression. So what I would suggest that we ask as general questions, so we could be sitting down as a team to consider these groups of kids. Bottom right quadrant, so students who are low growth, but they're high achievement. What we want to know is this normal? Is this the case in general for these students? Or is it just specific students where we're seeing that bit of stagnation? Consider whether or not are these students already in a gifted and talented program? Are they being given appropriate extension options so that they can continue to experience that growth and start to reverse that regression? And like I mentioned before, I would think that it could be the case that in that bottom right quadrant, some of those kids could be coasting. This is an opportunity as well to check, is there a well-being related reason for their stagnation or regression? You know your kids best. So I would suggest that when you see all of these different plot points, there's not necessarily going to be a lot of surprises, but it could be that by visualizing it in this way, you start to realize, okay, I thought that they were still, growing, but perhaps we've started to see a bit of that shift. So by having this data at your fingertips, The idea is that you're able to intervene hopefully sooner rather than later and to identify any particular causes for that regression. When we look at the bottom left quadrant, as you can imagine, some of those questions are similar. So we want to know, is this the case in general for this student, or is there a specific subject in which they are struggling? So they aren't showing growth and they're not showing strong achievement. In that case, have the appropriate scaffolds been put in place to support these kids? Do we know that they have extra support to give them opportunities to succeed where they can? Do the students already have an ILP? Or do they need to be referred to the individual needs advisor? This could be the bit of data that you need to say, actually, I think it's time. I think it's time to make sure that we refer this student to the right supports such that, again, we can change the story, we can get them growing again. Are there wellbeing reasons? Similarly to those who might be high achievers but low growth, there could be wellbeing reasons that need to be taken into consideration when putting those most appropriate scaffolds in place. And then I would say, actually, this bottom dot point could go into that top set of questions as well. It's an opening for discussion with colleagues. Again, you all know the kids so well. In some cases, you see these kids most of the day, every single weekday. Talk to each other about what works best. It could be that's what's working really well for Darcy in maths. There could be a way to translate that to help him improve in English. So jumping off point for conversation. Some general interventions for all students. So again, if we consider that we're looking at this either as an individual teacher, you might just be looking at your kids, or it could be that you're looking from like a year level lens. So when looking at individual learning domains, so we want to consider, is this an opportunity for differentiation? So I've identified a group of kids who are in a reasonably similar position, especially where you've got that isolated just for science results or just for humanities results. And then also opportunities to group them up together where appropriate for different activities. And then when you are looking into individual students into that exploded view, it's an opportunity to broach conversation with parents, carers, colleagues about those interventions to get on the front foot as soon as we can. So in terms of a staff meeting suggestion, what I would suggest that you could look at doing as a group, I would have the staff come together, again, could be pairs, could be small groups, depending on the size of your team. I would then assign each pair or group a particular quadrant. So actually have them focus in on high growth, high achievement, or high growth, low achievement. And then this is actually an activity I'm about to go and do with a school in about a fortnight. What they are then going to do is within their small group, because they all teach different classes, they're going to pick a small number of kids from each of their classes within that quadrant. So those who fall in that quadrant, and then actually do a bit of a deep dive into that student. So particularly in that exploded view where you see all of the different points that make up that position for the student, it's a really excellent opportunity to identify any discordance between their results. So for example, let's say we're looking at NAPLAN, of course. It could be that for Xavier, his NAPLAN numeracy results are actually quite strong. He showed some growth and he was starting to move down towards that right-hand side where he is showing good achievement. But perhaps it tells a different story when we look at his teacher judgments. It could be that actually in maths in class, that's not necessarily the case. So to open up that quadrant chart, it's, again, an opportunity to say, well, what's the reason behind that? What's the potential explanation behind that discordance? And then naturally, we want to explore, what are we going to do about it? So just naturally, I think that this conversation will evolve really easily. We want the staff to be sharing with each other knowledge about the kids that they're looking at together, because it could be that there is some crossover with the students they teach, or it could be that they're completely different. We want to be sharing knowledge about the kids' experiences that have been both successful and unsuccessful in terms of strategies, with a view to broadening our view of what works best for these kids. So we're very much sharers by nature, I think, as teachers, but to give a basis for conversation by having a look at what all of their different results are, what kind of story that's telling, and then to use that to discuss what's going on in the real world in the classroom as well. I would then, depending on how much time you've got, this could be something that takes multiple meetings, or it could be something that you want to do as a reasonably short and sharp activity. You want to have the staff come back and actually share thoughts. So again, because you've designated one group to look at high growth, high achievement, we want that group to share their knowledge with those who are looking at low growth, low achievement. We want all of that knowledge to be shared around as well. Okay, so we've had a look through the standardized testing cohort report, and we've also had a look through the relative growth report. This is the tip of the iceberg. So as you can imagine, the data there, it's having it is one thing, but then knowing what to do with it is another. So I really do hope that just giving you a couple of little ideas there of what can be done with the data, I hope you can take that away and actually incorporate it into what you do with your own classes or what you do with your own departments. I do want to talk a little bit about further training opportunities for those schools who are already subscribing. So I will say first and foremost, for the lovely teachers in the audience who are subscribers to Schoolbox, your first point of contact when it comes to training are your wonderful Schoolbox engagement managers. So if you are interested in any of that, please do reach out to them, and I know they'll be very happy to hear from you. But I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, so my role primarily is to work with schools on training that's really been tailored to what the different strategic aims of the school are to help you achieve your goals around data. So very much bespoke, very much research backed. And I love to incorporate principles around data literacy. Data visualization is just a natural thing in our dashboards, but coming from that teacher background, pedagogical best practice is what's most important for me. I've also worked with schools to create data plans. So sometimes when I work with a school, it's a session that's with a large group of staff and it's on a reasonably standard sort of PD afternoon. And then with a few schools, I think a few of whom are in the audience, I'm actually doing more long-term training where we're working together over the course of a year to build out a strategy around data, to reflect on what's currently being done and to consider what can be done to improve data practice in general and to bring the whole staff along on the journey. This training I do both virtual, I absolutely do face-to-face for those particularly around the Melbourne metropolitan area. So if you are interested, please do get in touch. I would love to hear from you. And I'm aware that we do have some wonderful audience members who might not already be subscribing to Intellischool. So obviously we'd love to chat with you further. I'd be really excited to walk you through what we can do specifically for your school, in your school's environment, to help you make the most of your data. Again, you'll get a copy of these slides, so please don't stress if you don't want to scan the QR code straight away. But we've got both a digital brochure, which goes into more detail about the other features that we didn't cover today. And then we've also got a link where you can book directly in for a tailored demo. And that way we can walk you through your specific context, what can be done to make sure that this is the best possible solution for you inside your already existing environments as well. Oh, quick PD is a good PD. So 440, that's not too bad. Now I should check. I'm going to actually I will leave this up and I will do one last plug before I check for questions. Please do follow us on socials. We're quite active and we love to share not only what's going on with us as a company, but also articles about best practice, sharing different tips and tricks for teachers. So please do give us a follow if you are on any of those social platforms. Okay, what I'm going to do is stop sharing my screen and I'm going to check in to see if we've got any questions. And here's the wonderful Rowan who's joining us now. So Rowan is our esteemed head of product. So what did we get? Did we get any questions, Rowan, that we need to answer?
We did, and we had it's a good one. Nick,
okay.
thanks for your question. Jade, maybe I'll get this one. I think Dave's put it up on the screen there.
Yep.
With regards regression, that's the same advice that we've had, Nick. That the way that NAPLAN is scaling, or CAR is scaling NAPLAN results is different. The time sequence effectively starts again, so backwards comparison is not advised. There's a number of ways to skin. I was going to say cat. That's a horrible expression. There's a number of ways to do comparisons, though. So just an objective scaled score to scaled score is probably something we'll avoid, just because, as I said, the way they're scaling scores is different. However, what we can do is a number of more relative measures of a student's change in their rank within their cohort, the distance from the state-based mean. So we can look at how their scores varied relative to some other measure, where they were last time compared to X, and that X may be their rank in their cohort at the school, same kids at the school, or state-based benchmarks. So we will tread cautiously. All of our schools rely on being able to look at current NAPLAN results and see the degree to which they've moved the needle. And our first port of call will be working with schools and looking at an individual student's question level analysis. So, I mean, there's really no better way of understanding a student's progress than looking at skills that they were not able to do last time that they can now demonstrate. Hopefully that's an adequate question, but I'm happy to provide more detail if you wanted to get in touch, Nick.
Beautiful. Well, from what I can tell, I don't think we've got any further questions. So how's that for timing? I still have my teacher timing skills somewhere up there in the back of my head. So we're really, really grateful again for you giving up your time to come along to the webinar this afternoon. Again, subscribers, non-subscribers, anything we can do to support you, please do get in touch. Those of you who have registered, you will receive an email following this with a link to the recording, as well as the slides and a couple of other useful resources as well. So thank you again for joining, and we will look forward to having you join us next time.